Welcome again to Let's Talk Gardens. Today's presentation is Shifting Boundaries, Approaches to American Landscapes. And I'm so excited to have joining us today three members of the collaborative curatorial practice behind this new exhibition, Shifting Boundaries at the National Museum of Asian Art. So today we have Lauren Brandes, Smithsonian Gardens landscape architect, Melinda Witcher, Smithsonian Gardens supervisory horticulturist, and Diana Greenwold, the National Museum of Asian Art's Lunder Curator of American Art. Thank you all for joining us. And with that, Diana, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Katie. I'm going to share my screen. Is everyone able to see our brilliant red introductory slide? Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here to chat with you all a little bit about this project and the collaboration that Lauren, Melinda, and I, as well as several other of our colleagues engaged with for this project. The way we're going to work this talk this afternoon is that we're going to start with a little bit of history around the landscape surrounding the Freer Gallery of Art, as well as a little bit of the history around the collection. Why, for instance, we are talking about American landscapes at the National Museum of Asian Art. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the process that we went through for this exhibition, which was very different from the way we typically make exhibitions here. We're then going to ask you all, as Katie mentioned, to participate in a looking exercise similar to what many of our colleagues and collaborators did in developing the labels for their work. And then we'll finish with Melinda and Lauren exploring some of the themes that resonated for them in some of the specific works that they chose to talk about for the exhibition. So without further ado, Katie introduced us, so I'm actually just going to start by passing it off to Lauren to tell us a little bit about the history of the space around the National Museum of Asian Art.
Thank you, Diana. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, as Diana mentioned before we sort of dive into the exhibition, I just wanted to kind of ground everybody as to where the museum is and kind of think about the time period in which the works that we looked at for the exhibition and the time period in which they were being painted, and compare that to sort of what was happening here at the Smithsonian Institution during that time period. So right now we're looking at a picture of the south side of the Smithsonian Institution building, which we affectionately call the Castle building. This is in the late 1890s. The castle opened in 1855. And in that time period, from its opening up to the late 1800s, the institution was really coming into itself, understanding what its purpose was and how to move forward to become such a large museum complex. There was a lot of changes going on around the National Mall area. It was going through development, eventually getting to the point where it is nowadays, but there was still a lot of things in flux. We're looking at an image that I really love that shows bison here on the south side of the castle. This is just kind of demonstrating that at that time period, we didn't have the beautiful gardens that we have now. The castle building and the surrounding areas were in flux. They had bison there to talk about conservation of bison. And eventually when the zoo was built, the bison were relocated there. But this area transformed into a number of different kinds of spaces. A few years around this time period is when the first museum building was built, the Arts and Industries building. So there was a lot of change going on, a lot of momentum to build this larger museum complex. Next slide. And then here is a picture that's from the other side of the castle, from the mall side on the north side, looking back towards the castle building. The Freer Gallery of Art was opened in 1923, so 5 years before this picture was taken. Off to the far right of the picture is where you can actually see a little bit of that building structure there. But this is what it looked like around the time period where the Freer Gallery was built. The National Museum of Natural History was built about opened up about 10 years prior to that. So there were a lot of changes going on in this whole area with the development of the museums there. Go ahead, next slide. And I'll pass it back to Diana to talk a little bit more about the actual building of the Freer Gallery and the works there.
Thanks, Lauren. So as you all saw from that image from 1928, the Freer Gallery of Art was built very close to the Smithsonian Castle. We were one of the very early structures on the mall. Our founder, Charles Lang Freer, signed paperwork with the Smithsonian in 1906. Though he passed away in 1919, this building opened, as Lauren mentioned, in 1923. That makes us actually the first art gallery on the National Mall. And in this beautiful Beaux-Arts building that is continues to kind of anchor this side of the mall today. Our collections are really, the nucleus of them remain those of Charles Lang Freer, our founder. Charles Lang Freer, like many collectors of his moment, began actually as a collector of prints, of lithographs, and etchings, and he began with an interest in James McNeill Whistler. So Whistler is a very famous American expatriate painter who was living in Europe at the time. He and Freer developed a personal relationship, and Freer subsequently came to amass one of the largest and most comprehensive collections of Whistler's work. That's still one of the cornerstones of our museum collection. It was actually Whistler who encouraged Charles Lang Freer to begin being interested in works of art from across Asia. It's Whistler who encouraged Freer to travel in Asia and to collect. And so our collection, very much from the beginning, thanks to Whistler, represents both what was contemporary American art for Freer at that moment, but also works of art from across Asia as Freer traveled, as Freer learned more, as Freer gained an interest and appreciation for objects that were coming from around the world. So interesting always for me to recognize that the first museum on the National Mall is one that actually tells this cross-cultural and cross-chronological story. But in terms of the types of objects and collections that we have in the American collection, what Freer gave to the Smithsonian in 1906 and what we put on view for the first time in 1923 is very much a collection that's rooted in Whistler. It's also a collection that is rich in a small number of artists who Freer had personal relationships with. These are artists like Dwight Tryon, whose work you're seeing here, as well as Thomas Wilmer Dewing and Abbott Henderson Thayer. Principally, we have deep collections in a couple of artists, but many of the images that we have are landscapes that depict New England in the late 19th and early 20th century. And the way, until I got here fairly recently, I'm about 3 years in my tenure in this role, but the way that we have tended to explore these works of art has been to describe them in terms of how Freer appreciated them and those relationships across our collection, or to think about them as very situated within these artists' practice. What I wanted to do was to think about a new way that we might consider this collection of American landscape paintings. And I thought about this principally because there are a couple of kind of funny restrictions on the American collection at the Freer. So unlike many collections in the Smithsonian or in a typical museum, the way Freer developed his will when he donated these works to the Smithsonian was to suggest that no works would ever be loaned out of this collection, nor in the context of the Freer Gallery would any works ever come in on loan into the collection. Furthermore, as a stipulation to the American collection, we have also read this will to mean that we can't purchase new objects into the American collection. So what all of this means is that while my colleagues in American art and in galleries across the country, as they're considering how to bring in new voices, a lot of them are bringing really dynamic works by contemporary artists to bring into collections by buying them or putting them on view as a loan. None of that is available as you're thinking about the historic collections at the Freer. What is available is a plethora of fascinating and super invested collaborators who we brought together. Because the idea was really, we don't bring new and contemporary objects, but we can bring new and contemporary perspectives. So our thinking was, and with some Terra funding, we were able to do this, was we could bring together this fascinating group of people who all had particular expertises in different types of approaches to landscapes. So that's everything from Quinawampanoag artist and marine scientist Elizabeth James Perry to Lorette Picciano, who is the executive director of the Rural Coalition, to Melinda and Lauren, who come from this wonderfully rich gardens perspective, to be able to talk to us about how we can view these landscapes in new ways, how we can bring new stories to these landscapes, and how we can also empower our visitors to understand that the perspectives that they bring to these landscapes have value, and that they can utilize their tools and their own experience to be able to see these works in new ways. So we got this funding, as I mentioned, and I will say too that uh, this community buy-in is something that many of my colleagues are also working on to varying degrees at many other institutions. But what we wanted to do was pilot this from the very beginning of a project, so that we came together as a group to explore, to pick objects together, to develop themes together, to select a checklist together, to figure out how they were going to exist in the gallery space together. So this fully collaborative model was a new one, but it was one that, as Melinda and Lauren will talk about, I found tremendously rewarding, and I think yielded us a really interesting new way to see our collections.
So I'm going to jump in now and talk a little bit about the process that we went through for this exhibition. As Diana mentioned, she pulled together this group of us to come together to work together. With the exception of Melinda, I knew nobody else in the group. So it was essentially a group of seven, mostly strangers coming together to try to create the ideas for this exhibition, to explore what were some of our commonalities, and also to dig into how we see things differently, what perspectives we bring to our own interpretation of these works of art. None of us are experts at all at the works of art that we were looking at. I think many of us was our first exposure to some of these artists. So we're coming in from a perspective of not really knowing this art history side of things, but we each had our own perspective to give about our own views of landscapes, our own histories of working either professionally or personally with land, and having that contribute to the process. It was a really extremely collaborative process. As Diana mentioned, we got together several times on Zoom, as we're all used to doing these days, but we also had the opportunity to have some collaborations in person. One of the real highlights for me was being able to go into the museum, into their storage, where they have these works of art, and be able to actually see them in person, to see, all these works that some of which have not been on display for quite a long period of time. It was an opportunity to take some time to really look at these paintings and these pastels, all these pieces, in a way that I personally, I enjoy art and I love going to museums, but I honestly don't spend a lot of time really just looking at a piece of art and sitting with it for a few minutes just to notice what is present in that picture, what resonates with me. Um, Through this process, we got to do that a number of times, and it opened up my eyes personally to understanding that even if I don't have an understanding of the history of the artist or the place or the context in which it was painted, what my own personal perspective is can contribute to how I respond to that. It can contribute to conversations about that art that are conversations that are rooted in the things that I'm thinking about today in 2024, the things that are pertinent to what I do, how I see the world. The process was a way to explore those ideas and bring those current thoughts to these works that were created over 100 years ago. So it was personally for me, it was a really fulfilling process. But I think it was really interesting to hear from everybody in the group. And oftentimes we had very different perspectives or different thoughts about what we were seeing. And it was really exciting to hear what everybody had to say about it. I'm going to pass it off to Melinda because she was there as well. And I think she had, similar and also some different perspectives to it as well.
Yeah, and most definitely. You covered a lot of it, Lauren, but I think one of the best parts about doing this collaborative project was meeting all of these interesting people. And like you said, finding out how they're looking at the art and what they're getting from it too. And so we would all look at the exact same piece of art and people would see totally different things. It would evoke totally different emotions and they would walk away with something completely different. So between just the 7 of us, we were seeing that with almost every piece of art. And so multiply that by however many people are coming into the museum. So it really interesting to take this idea of looking at different people's perspective and putting that up as part of the exhibit. What I appreciate so much about that is that I think hopefully it makes the visitor more comfortable expressing how they feel about that piece of art and not feeling like anything that they think or feel or see when they're looking at that piece of art is wrong, because it's not wrong. Art is very personal. And I think that the way that we did this exhibit made it feel really very personal. And again, invited other people to allow it to be personal as well. One of my favorite parts of doing this exhibit, I'm so glad this picture came up when you passed it off to me, Lauren. I don't know exactly how many pieces of art that we actually looked at while we were trying to select the pieces that were going to go into the exhibit. We had a finite amount of room, and some of these pieces were bigger than others, so we had to take that into consideration as well. But so we went through all of these pieces of art, and Diana presented us with these printouts so that we could stick them up on the wall and kind of see them all together. And some of these pieces were things that, for example, I thought was wonderful and amazing. And maybe one of the other people who was there was, it's fine. So what we ended up doing was taking these sticky notes, which is what you can see in this picture here, and not really, I guess it was kind of like voting, but putting a sticky note on the pieces that really spoke to us. And that was kind of the beginning of our selection process. So it was a way of like kind of making sure that all the people who were collaborating were represented with the final product. And the pieces that really spoke to a lot of us were kind of like shoe-ins, like that one is definitely going in. But what I will say too that was really nice was that if there was a piece that really strongly spoke to even just one person, we did everything we could to make sure that that piece went into the exhibit, because I think that was what we were looking for, was that really strong reaction to these pieces of art from all of these different perspectives.
Just wanted to add to that with that sense of how you respond to it. There were a couple of pieces that ended up in the exhibition, which I personally really did not like, the art pieces when I first saw them. And even going through my own process of thinking about the pieces and how I would respond to them or what thoughts came about, I still found really little connection to them. And for whatever reason, they just didn't appeal to me. Well, a couple of those pieces ended up in the exhibition. And after reading the labels that the other, a couple of the other collaborators wrote about them, it just opened my eyes, and I thought, wow, I was so moved by what they were, what they wrote, what their perspective was. And it really did give me a sense of um, that experience of, okay, there's something more to this. And even though I personally didn't resonate with it or I didn't have a connection to it, seeing how somebody else had that kind of connection made me appreciate the art more than I had before. So it was, the whole process was demonstrating exactly what I think Diana was hoping we would get out of it. It really did show that individual perspective can invite more conversation, invite more people who maybe felt like they wouldn't be connected to these kinds of works of art to be there and to share their experience. So it's wonderful.
I love hearing you both talk about the experience because I do think, I mean, some of that was anticipated and much of that also emerged because we had a really wonderful group that was kind of deeply respectful of how everyone was bringing both professional and personal expertise and experience to these works. I will say too that every time I do these types of collaborative projects, it's remarkable to see works that I think I know very well in particular contexts kind of turned on their head as everyone brings their own varying experiences to bear on them. Which is a lovely segue into an invitation to you all to do a little bit of the type of work that we did together. So on one of our early Zooms, I used, in fact, this very painting to invite our collaborators to flex a muscle that not everyone uses every day, which, as Lauren mentioned, is just to spend a little bit of time with a work of art, to explore it, to see it in its detail, in its composition, to perhaps consider some of the questions that I offer here on the right, questions around color or composition or brushwork, questions around what our figures are up to or the overall mood of the artwork. And we did an exercise that we'd like to do with you now, which is to really just let you have a chance to look at this work by Winslow Homer, painted in 1801 and then reworked in the early 20th century. So I'm gonna time us for a couple of minutes, but we invite you to, as you reflect on this, share your thoughts in the chat. We will monitor that and talk a little bit about how you respond to a work of art like this, whether it is related to a personal experience with them, with the work of art, or whether there is something formally that is exciting to you as you're taking a peek. So I'll give a couple minutes and then we will come back together and I can collate a little bit the experiences and the responses that we're getting. Well, please keep these wonderful impressions coming. I'm really enjoying monitoring the chat a little bit. And I wanted to just come back together to share a little bit of some of the history of the painting, but also some of these beautiful observations that everyone has been sharing. Also, just a little bit of technical explanation. Somebody asked an excellent question around what we mean when we say brushwork, and that actually has to do with the physical application of paint onto the canvas. You're running into one of the real reasons why museums exist in the first place, which is to see these works of art in person. So brushwork is something that is amply evident when we are face to face with a work like this. You can actually see, for instance, the kind of gesture and movement. Somebody kind of beautifully noted the way in which you can actually kind of feel that ocean breeze and the wind taking the skirts of these two fisherwomen off into back towards the land. And that is actually evoked in the very kind of way in which Homer applies the paint to the canvas with his brush. So that's something that you'll come visit us and you will see that in a beautifully much more evident way. Similarly, there was a question around the darkness of the figures. This kind of evocative mood is very evident in our galleries as well, but some of the details become a little clearer when you see this work in person, particularly that fisherman on the left. Interestingly, we believe he was a later addition to this painting. You'll see that it has 2 dates on it. So this painting was painted first, begun in 1881 when Homer was sojourning for over a year in a small fishing village in England called Cullercoats. He really was living and working in that small fishing community. He became enamored of the men who went out to fish very far off into the ocean over the course of a day, but extremely interested in the work of the women who were the ones left behind. So you can see these these kind of resolute columns, these 2 women, young women who anchor this composition. Several of you mentioned that beautiful red color that you can see in the sunset in the bottom right of this. But you'll also see that Homer echoes that in the knitting that one of these women is up to, as well as in her scarf. These are costumes that would have been particular to Cullercoats, but Homer has actually finished this painting in Maine. Where he spends the last third of his career. So the shale schist rocks that you're seeing here are actually very much what would have been out his front door, or his back door rather, in Prouts Neck in Maine, just outside of Portland. The vegetation as well, you're seeing this kind of dual composition here. And we know too that Homer had a 3rd female figure here. He painted it out. So standing to the right of the figure, that one of those female figures. So some of you also mentioned that kind of wonderful use of wide swaths of negative space. We see him playing with that as he's adjusting this painting and this composition over time. That notion too of early evening, of that very kind of strange dark light giving a sense of mood and allowing him to kind of use those shadowy figures is something that several of you picked up on in just lovely ways. We believe that crescent moon also to have been a somewhat later addition to the composition. I'll just mention too that Stephanie Pearson was I'm sorry, Stephanie Toothman was one of our collaborators who has a career is in the National Park Service, and she took a look at this painting and had a really personal response to it. So she was kind enough to share an image of her grandmother and her grandmother's sister as these kind of very, again, stalwart young women who in Stephanie's family had really held down the fort in a fishing family in Nova Scotia. But Stephanie saw this, and the connection was immediately made to another set of women who faced the kind of odds and uncertainties of life on the coast, as Homer's depicting here. But for her, also had that kind of same sense of interiority, sense of strength that we very much, I think, gather from this pair of women. Lauren and Melinda, anything else from the chat that that you wanted to call out? There's really some very beautiful beautiful observations, and I'm trying to keep up.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people did comment about the sky, and the red sky being a warning sign for people who live along the coastline. And yeah, I think in our group, this was one of the first paintings that we looked at as a collaborative group and went through this process specifically with this painting. It's interesting to see a lot of the same things kind of recurring in people's observations of it.
Yeah, and I think of Homer as just one of the kind of most astute observers of what it means to live this existence on the coastline, where you are partially embedded and invested in a waterscape, but also in a landscape. But that sense of motion, of wind buffeting both the figures, but also the way that the very trees and vegetation then kind of have to move and adjust to the way the winds come off of the ocean, is just a beautiful way in which Homer is able to evoke that landscape. So thank you all for taking a moment with us to look carefully. I am going to now turn it back over to Melinda and Lauren to share a little bit of how they approached a couple of the other works in the exhibition. I will also, of course, note that the exhibition is up for at least another year and a half, so there's plenty of time to come join us and enjoy it. But any and all of these works are very much best appreciated when you're standing face to face with them.
So for the exhibition, there were 3 pieces that I wrote labels for, and this is just one of the pieces that I observed and felt kind of a intrigue and was really interested in. This is a piece by Twachtman called "The Hidden Pool," and it's interesting that the discussion of brushwork came up in the previous picture, because the brushwork in this one is, to me, it's obviously very active. I feel like sort of this frenetic energy when I look at this painting. The title gives a little hint that what you are looking at is a sort of a pool that you can kind of see towards the center of the painting. So when I was beginning this process and looking at the pieces, this one really stood out to me. It was very different from a lot of the other pieces that we were looking at. It had its own sort of individual style. It had a sense of kind of blurriness that I found really intriguing. And when I began to look at it more closely, it started to make me think of this term plant blindness that we use a lot here in terms of Smithsonian gardens, and trying to think about how people think about plants, how they a lot of time are completely unaware of the plants that are surrounding them. And I I sort of started to see this painting as kind of a representation of that view. It certainly isn't what Twachtman, I think, was trying to capture when he painted this painting. But from my perspective, my point of view in the 21st century, and thinking about my 20 plus years as a landscape architect, and thinking a lot about how people interact with the land, how we manipulate the land, how people experience being outdoors around plants, I really began to think about this in that sense of a lot of people move through this world in a way, the plants that they're walking by are kind of like this blurred view that this painting represents. I think there's this sense of plant blindness, gives that sense of when you see, say, an image, a picture, outdoors, if there's an animal there or a building, our eyes kind of pick up on that and not so much the plant material, the space that is around that. And so I wanted to explore that a little bit in the way I was thinking about this painting and how it relates to me in the time period in which we are now. You can go to the next slide, which is really just a contrast. Obviously, this is a photograph, so it's going to have a sharper resolution to it. And I know that this is a self-selected group who already is interested in gardens and plants and art. And but I think this image is kind of a good illustration. It's kind of a good counterpoint to that Twachtman view of this sort of a lot of vegetation, a lot of things going on around you. This is a view of the Ripley Garden, not very far from the Freer Gallery. And I think a lot of people move through this space, and certainly there are people who are focused in on the plants, but I think a lot of people do move through it. It's a cut through from one place to another, and without really stopping to think about the plants that are around them, what these plants are, the importance of these plants. And for me, it's really trying to open up people's eyes so that they are aware of what they're passing by, what the plants are. If we don't have a sense of awareness and connection to our natural world, then we don't have that sense of wanting to try to protect it and understand that it's precious and that it needs attention and needs protection. So without having that awareness, you start to lack that kind of connection to it. We always say here at Smithsonian Gardens, I mean, obviously we're very focused on plants. That's what we're here for. But if all of us, if you eat food or you breathe air, we're all relying on plants for sustaining us and for our very being. So just wanted to explore that through the painting and some of my own personal thoughts about the importance of being aware of the plant life that is around you, so that we do feel connected to try to protect it as much as we can.
Okay, and it's my turn. But I'm going to just share an observation really quickly about what Lauren was just saying about plant blindness. And you were talking, Lauren, about how even when there's a focus in the middle of a picture, but the picture is 90% plants or even more than that, that you don't see the plants. And that painting, the Twachtman painting, is called The Hidden Pool. And the hidden pool is about that big, and 98% of that painting is plants, and it's not called the beautiful forest, it's called the hidden pool. So it's kind of neat, like maybe it did exist even all the way back then, that concept of plant blindness. So sorry to go off on a little tangent. This was one of the paintings called The White Pasture by Willard Metcalf that I was assigned to do the interpretive panel for. So I believe I was tapped for this project in general because of my horticulture background. But in my personal life, I am also a painter and I write poetry. And I do think that when I sat down to write my narrative of this painting and of the other one that I was assigned, the artistic side of me kind of took over. I'm quite certain that the horticulture is in there because it's been in there since forever. But I really just felt a lot of emotions, I think, came out in my writing about these paintings. So when we were selecting the paintings for this particular painting was not an immediate standout. Like Lauren was saying, it was a little bit different from a lot of the other paintings that we were looking at. And this one wasn't a standout. It's kind of plain, for lack of a better word. There's not a whole lot of colors. It doesn't feel like in your initial impression that there's a lot going on. And to be honest, the first time I saw it was on a computer screen, like you're probably looking at it right now. And I was like, it's fine. And then I went to the Freer Gallery and Diana pulled out one of those big shelves that had all of the actual paintings. And this comes back to the brushstroke comment. And I saw this one in real life, in person, face to face, and I was just blown away. I loved it. Had way more of a visceral reaction to it than I had looking at it on the computer. So on that note, anybody who's able to come down to the Freer and look at this exhibit in person, I strongly recommend that you do that. So when I saw this painting in person, I think I was attracted to it because of the quiet and the still that I felt looking at it. I could almost immediately imagine the same landscape in the spring. I could smell the grass and, see beautiful green trees and a blue sky. I think there's probably a creek or a brook running through there. So hearing the water and the birds and the insects, all of these things. But the artist chose to paint this landscape in winter. And it's still so dynamic, despite the fact that there's not as much contrast as there would be in a spring painting. It's very muted, pastels, lots of different shades of white. And kind of like the Twachtman painting, it's very hazy, almost indistinct. It's not crisp. It's almost like the shadow of a spring landscape, and it just feels so quiet and beautiful to me. So I think a lot of what I loved about it was reminding me to appreciate seasonality of all of our landscapes, both our natural landscapes and our planned landscapes. at Smithsonian Gardens, and I'm sure at every garden, we talk a lot about winter interest. So we want people to come to our gardens all the time. We don't want them to just enjoy them in spring. We want them to enjoy them all the time. And so we look to incorporate winter interest into our gardens. So when we're talking about what plants and features we're going to add to our design landscape, we're trying to think about how that's going to interact in the winter. In that painting, even though it's winter, you can still see the sweeping land, kind of the bones of the deciduous shrubs and all of these beautiful things. And so here we have a picture of 2 of our gardens at Smithsonian Gardens, covered in snow, still lovely. And so we are purposely putting things into our gardens that will still be beautiful in winter. So we have our dragonfly sculptures. In the painting on the left is actually the Moongate Garden, which is right outside of the Freer. And also just the way that the linear architecture of the Moongate fountain itself kind of is accentuated by the snow being there. The other picture is one of our magnolias, and it's like that dark trunk and branches, just really contrasted by the snow. So thinking about the bones of the garden, or from the painting of the natural landscape, and just how it can still be accentuated by snow, or by not being barren, a tree being beautiful because its leaves are gone. And so that was what really attracted me to this painting, and wanting to talk about it. So.
Thank you all. I'm going to stop sharing and invite Katie back and take some questions from the audience if there are any, for either Lauren, Melinda, or myself.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you all so much for that wonderful presentation. And yes, I've really been enjoying the responses in the chat as well. But as Diana mentioned, we have some time for questions. So if you have any questions about the presentation that we've seen so far, or want to learn more about the process of putting together this exhibition, please feel free to drop them in the chat. So I'll give it a few moments here in case people are formulating, but Zach also dropped the link to learn more about the exhibition. Should you if you're in the DC area or find yourself traveling here, it is on display, I believe, until 2026. Is that correct, Diana?
Yeah, it is on view through the United States 250th anniversary, as one small way that the Smithsonian is celebrating the 250th anniversary of the United States is through these updated perspectives on historic landscapes.
Fantastic. So we have a couple of questions. Is there any way to view the paintings and labels online? And how many works are there in the exhibit?
I should know that off the top of my head. I think we ended up around 20. It's not an enormous gallery. It's the larger of the 2 that we dedicate to American art, but there's a lot of nuance that goes into how many works are on any given wall, what work is going to work well alongside a different one. So I think we ended up with around 20. Some of them are also works on paper, so they will be rotating out every 6 months. And I saw there was a question about viewing the paintings and the labels online. We do have a website that provides a couple of the images, some of the images for this, as well as more information about our collaborators. But at the moment, I think the only way to read the labels is to come in and enjoy them in the galleries. We are working on an audio component. Several of these of our collaborators, all of our collaborators, were kind enough to do a recording with us when they came in to celebrate the opening. And so that will be a feature that is on the website, hopefully before too long, but that also involves these collaborators answering a few questions, but also reading their labels.
Fantastic. I've dropped the link where you can learn more about the collaborators and the homepage for the exhibition in the chat. A question for Lauren and Melinda. Has your participation in this initiated any changes to how you consider planting design? Let's see, like large scale effect versus detail effect, scale, texture, color, etc. So either Melinda or Lauren, if you want to start, any new ways you're looking at your work in our gardens?
Say that not as I don't feel like it's informed or any changes or ways that I look at things, just really more to open my eyes to realize how I am looking at things. Really made me very aware about the sort of career path that I've taken and how that has shaped a lot of how I look at landscapes. And so it's been more about sort of a personal awareness of my own personal history and how that shaped my views, less so about me thinking differently about what we're doing at Smithsonian Gardens.
I would say that answer resonates with me as well. One of the artists that we looked at, Tryon, there were a lot of paintings of his that when we were looking at them, we talked a lot about what did this landscape look like before farmers came. There were just a lot of indications that it used to be a lush forest, and now it was not. Now it was spindly trees, and that there had probably been lots of foliage previously that had been removed. So like Lauren, I don't think that it has changed my design perspective necessarily, but I do think that it's given me a different way of looking at some landscapes and thinking differently about them. So like literally my perspective has changed in how I'm viewing landscapes, and frankly also how I view art. So I appreciate that on a personal level. Thank you.
And thank you both for sharing. Diana, there's definitely interest in the chat in other ways to share this exhibit's content with folks who cannot travel to DC at that time. So make sure we'll forward these thoughts and questions to you all as this exhibit continues to run. But we also have a question about, oh, yeah, Diana just answered it in the chat regarding the funding for the exhibition. Thank you, the Terra Foundation of American Art. Any other questions from our participants today?
I see one about the works of paper being rotated out.
Oh.
Or the works on paper being rotated out. I'm going to let Diana field it, but I wanted to make sure it got answered.
Sure. And I see one too around restrictions into the collection, which I could talk a lot about, but we'll give you the succinct answer. Well, first off, to works on paper are light sensitive. So the longer they are out, the more they change. And that's both the paper, but also the pigments that are applied to them. So if you think about a museum as having kind of two jobs, one is to present works to the public in new ways, as we are doing. The other is very much as a steward of the objects that we have in our care in perpetuity. So we work with our conservators very, very closely to determine how long a work of art can be out. We chart every work on paper's kind of lifespan, but the general rule is every 6 months it is out. It rests for 3 to 5 years. So we think very carefully and seriously before any work on paper goes out on view, because we know that in order to take care of it, we then have to keep it off view for a certain amount of time. And that just a quick question about, or answer to the question around the collections. So those restrictions that Freer imposed, he grudgingly rescinded in a codicil related to all works in his Asian art collection, but not specifically to the works in his American collection. So if you look at what they're called accession numbers, but essentially those 4 digits that will tell you the year that any object came into the collection. Every collection that is not the American collection in the Freer, you'll see accession numbers going up to 2024. But we have read the will very strictly, which essentially suggested that the American collection he did not want to grow. So every other collection in the Freer does grow, and it's a whole nother story for works that are on view in the other building that are not in the Freer collection. Because as I said, he said that none of the work could leave the Freer building, pretty much. So most everything you see in that building is Freer specific.
Thanks, Diana. Well, I'm not seeing any other additional questions in the chat. I'll give one more scroll here. Let's see here, but we so appreciate you all sharing your story of how this came together and this wonderful way of bringing new voices into the museum and the exhibition. It's really wonderful to check out in person, and we appreciate you making it possible to bring at least a little bit to all of our folks joining us from across the country.